Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The maps were spread across the steel surface. Red markers lined the valley. Blue pins clustered like fragile glass beads on a ridge. A dozen officers leaned over the plans, murmuring, debating, cutting each other off. She sat in silence, a notebook open, pen resting in her hand. But when she raised her voice, calm, deliberate, no one turned. Her suggestion evaporated in the stale air, buried under the louder confidence of men who believed she had nothing to add. She closed her mouth again, the words trapped. It wasn't the first time. Captain had worn the flight suit for almost 8 years, hours in the simulator, hundreds of flight hours in the A-10 Thunderbolt, the Warthog, a platform she loved for its brutal honesty. It didn't forgive mistakes, but it didn't lie either. If you flew right, it gave you strength. If you slipped, it punished you. A machine that demanded respect, much like she did. And yet in the eyes of the room, she wasn't a pilot. Not really. Not yet. The mission they were planning would be brutal. Ground forces were boxed into a valley, pinned by enemy fire from ridges that seemed to multiply weapons every time reconnaissance scanned them. The terrain was cruel, jagged, narrow, unforgiving. Helicopters were too vulnerable. Fast movers too quick to be precise. The brass needed something slower, tougher, built to endure punishment while carving holes in fortified ground. Her aircraft was perfect for it. But when she spoke, offering insight about how to angle the approach over the eastern ridge, the lieutenant beside her cleared his throat louder, drowning her out. She looked down. Ink smeared on the side of her hand where her pen had pressed too hard. It was always the same. They wanted her in the air but not in the room. She remembered the words from her first assignment, whispered but sharp enough to cut. She's here to check a box, nothing more. The doubt had followed her, into missions, into mess halls, into the silence of her quarters at night. She had carried it, hidden under discipline, masked with the precision of her reports, but it lived there like shrapnel no one else could see. The commander's voice brought her back. We'll finalize the flight assignments by tomorrow morning, that's all. Chairs scraped back. Conversations sparked as men slapped each other on the shoulders, exchanging quick smiles, trading jokes about who would draw the short straw. Gathered her notes in silence, sliding them into her folder. No one asked her what she thought. No one even noticed she hadn't spoken in the last 20 minutes. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. Later in the hangar, she found herself standing beneath her aircraft. The loomed above her like a beast made of steel and scars. Its broad wings seemed almost awkward, its fuselage blunt and unpolished compared to sleeker jets. But she saw beauty in its honesty. The titanium bathtub around the cockpit. The 7-barrel GAU-8 cannon slung under its nose, heavy as judgment. The twin engines humming like a warning. She ran her hand along the undercarriage, fingers brushing against cold metal. The crew chief glanced at her. "You'll get the sortie?" he asked casually. She hesitated. "They haven't said." He smirked. "They'd be stupid not to." She didn't answer. She'd learned long ago not to rely on what was obvious. The hangar echoed with distant clangs, the metallic symphony of maintenance. Her eyes lingered on the faded shark mouth painted on the nose of the jet, a relic from older wars. She imagined the pilots who had sat where she would sit tomorrow, men who had returned, men who had not. History whispered in rivets and scars. For a moment the weight pressed down on her. Not just the mission ahead, but the years of silence, of being seen and unseen all at once. The thing no one in the briefing room knew was this. She had flown this valley before. Not in combat, but in training runs, low-level terrain familiarization. She knew its ridges, its blind turns, its traps. She had memorized the way the wind curled between rocks. She had studied it when no one asked her to, because she knew someday it would matter. Tomorrow perhaps it would. That night she sat on her bunk, boots off, socks worn thin at the heel. The barracks were noisy, laughter from a card game, the muffled hum of someone's music speaker, the rattle of lockers opening and closing. She sat apart, leaning against the cool wall. Her journal lay open on her lap. She stared at the page. The words came slowly, like drops of water in dust. Ignored again at the table. But the valley, I know it. I see it when I close my eyes. If they let me fly, I'll prove it. If they do. Her pen stopped. She couldn't finish the sentence. Instead, she wrote, "Sometimes silence is heavier than noise." She closed the book. Sleep was shallow. She woke before dawn, heart restless, body tense. The sky outside was pale, the first edge of light cutting across the horizon. She pulled on her flight suit, tightening the zippers, securing her patches. Her hands moved with muscle memory, though her chest felt heavy. At the operations building, the board listed assignments. Her name was there, beside the A-10, beside the valley. She exhaled slowly. The others glanced at the board, some nodding, some muttering jokes. No one spoke to her. No congratulations, just silence. But inside her something stirred, a fragile determination. The mission brief was quick, weather clear, enemy entrenched, friendlies pinned. The ground commander's voice crackled through the radio. "If you don't get us cover, we won't hold another hour." She strapped in. The canopy closed. The world outside became muted, framed in glass and steel. The engine roared awake, vibrations running through her bones. Her hands rested on the throttle and stick, familiar weight, familiar control. In the distance, dust spiraled from the valley. She could almost feel the tension rising from below, men pinned behind rocks, waiting for the sky to answer. She whispered to herself, words no one else would hear. "See me now." And she pushed the throttle forward. The first run was quiet, too quiet. The valley stretched below, jagged and brutal. Enemy fire blinked from tracer rounds stitching the air, her radio filled with frantic voices. "Taking fire, can't move. They've got us locked down." She banked hard, pulling the Warthog into position. The aircraft groaned under the force, but it obeyed. She lined up the cannon. The crosshairs danced. Her finger hovered. And in that moment, she remembered every dismissal, every ignored suggestion, every time her voice had been drowned. The cannon roared. 7 barrels spun, spitting fire and metal. The ground shook. Stone shattered. Weapons went silent. And for the first time, silence wasn't heavy. It was earned. But this was only the beginning. She had fired. The sound still vibrated in her chest, the deep, grinding roar of the GAU-8 cannon, a voice unlike any other weapon in war. Ground shook. Air trembled. The smell of gunpowder lingered even inside the sealed cockpit, memory layered over reality. And then silence. Not peace. The radio was still screaming. The valley still burned with tracer fire. But for one stretched second, the ridge where her rounds had landed was quiet, as if the mountain itself had stopped breathing. Her jaw clenched, the stick trembled under her hand. She didn't celebrate, she didn't smile, she only breathed. The silence broke with a crackle in her headset. Good hits, keep it coming." The ground commander's voice carried a desperation she could almost feel pressing against her chest. Men were pinned. They had minutes, not hours. If she failed now, she wouldn't just lose a sortie, she'd lose them. She rolled the A-10 left, pulling hard, banking low through the valley. Enemy fire reached for her, red arcs of light crawling upward. The Warthog absorbed it like the beast it was built to be, armor shrugging off what should have torn her apart. Her breath came steady, calm, controlled, but her thoughts were restless. Do they still doubt me now? Another ridge ahead. She lined it up, her finger tightening. She hesitated just long enough to feel the weight of every choice. Each pull of the trigger was not just destruction, it was judgment. Where she aimed, lives ended. Where she didn't, lives on the ground might be lost instead. Her eyes narrowed. She fired again. The cannon ripped. The ridge erupted. Figures scattered, some disappearing in the dust cloud, others crushed beneath rock. She pulled up, banking out of the valley, heart pounding harder now. Not fear, something sharper, something deeper. The radio crackled again. "You're saving our asses down here. Keep those runs tight." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Words felt too fragile, too small for the moment. Instead, she let the aircraft speak for her. But doubt doesn't disappear with one mission. Even as she cut back around, preparing for another pass, she heard the voices, not from the headset, but from memory. Men in the mess hall, whispering when they thought she wasn't listening. Instructors who had graded her harsher than her classmates. Commanders who had smiled politely but never called on her. "She's not built for it. She's book smart, not battlefield smart. She'll crack when it matters." The words clung to her, like sand in sweat. And yet here she was, in the middle of a storm no one else wanted to fly into. She lined up her next pass. The ground forces marked their position with smoke. She could see their signal, small, fragile, a thread of color rising in chaos. She angled away from it, targeting the fire suppressing them. Rounds tore the ridge apart. Cleared hot, came the radio call. Relief, urgency, gratitude. Her pulse matched the rhythm of her gun. But even as her strikes landed, she felt the valley tightening around her. The terrain was unforgiving. Her fuel was draining faster than she'd like. Ammunition limited. She couldn't stay forever. And she hadn't told them something, not yet. As she pulled back to altitude, the world below seemed almost unreal. Tiny figures scrambling. Smoke pillars twisting skyward. Explosions blooming like grotesque flowers. And then she caught sight of something on the ridge opposite the pinned soldiers, something glinting in the sun. A barrel, longer than the rest, positioned carefully, not firing blindly like the others. Her stomach dropped. A heavy anti-air emplacement, hidden until now, waiting. She pulled hard, instinct screaming. Tracer fire split the sky where she had been a moment earlier. Her breath came sharp, ragged. The Warthog shuddered as rounds nicked its skin. Warning lights flickered red on her console. "Taking heavy fire," she muttered under her breath, though no one else needed to hear it. The ground commander's voice cut through. "Do not pull out, we're still trapped." Her eyes darted across the valley, scanning. Options flashed, dissolved, narrowed. She could climb out, return for refuel, rearm. But by the time she came back, the ridge would be lost and the men with it. Or she could stay, push into the teeth of that gun, trust the armor of the Warthog and the stubbornness in her chest. She closed her eyes for half a heartbeat. "See me now." When she opened them, her course was set. She dove. The valley rose up, walls of stone rushing past her canopy. The anti-air emplacement opened fire again, streaks of death cutting the air. Metal rang against armor. Lights blinked. Her hands didn't shake. She pulled the trigger. The cannon's voice thundered, drowning the valley. Rounds chewed through rock, steel, flesh. The emplacement crumbled, fire swallowing its crew. The recoil rattled her bones. Her teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached. And then silence again. Not peace, not safety, but silence. Her console lit up with damage reports, systems screaming for attention. But she was alive. The jet was alive. The ground commander's voice came back, thick with disbelief. "You took it out. You Jesus Christ, you took it out." Her lips parted, but no words came. She only exhaled, slow, steady. Because in her chest, she knew this was only the first test. As she circled back, fuel low, ammo nearly gone, she thought of the room again, the briefing table, the ignored words, the silence that had buried her. Would they believe her now? Would they finally hear her voice? And then another thought, sharper, darker. Do I even care anymore? Because up here, in the roar of engines and the fire of the cannon, she didn't need their permission to exist. Up here, she was undeniable. But even that truth carried weight. She banked once more, eyes scanning, knowing the fight was far from finished. Knowing the valley would test not just her skill, but the silence she had carried for years. And somewhere deep inside, she felt the question rising. Would silence define her again, or would this battle? How long could she keep going? The question pressed against her ribs with every breath, every glance at the fuel gauge sinking lower than she liked. Her ammo count stared back like a warning she couldn't ignore. The radio was alive with desperation. Ground forces pinned. Every second dragged them closer to collapse. She had already given more than anyone expected, more than anyone thought she was capable of. And still, it wasn't enough. The Warthog rattled under her hands, armor groaning from punishment. Her console blinked with alerts she muted just to think. Her body ached from the G-forces, muscles trembling under straps and weight. Sweat ran down her spine, cold despite the heat. But worse than the strain was the silence in her chest, that old silence. The same silence that followed her through briefings, through halls, through rooms where she was present but never seen. Even now, after all she had done, a whisper coiled inside her mind. What if they still don't believe? What if nothing changes? She shook her head hard as though the thought could be thrown out of the cockpit. Not now, not here. Below, the valley burned. Air support, we need another run. They're pushing hard on the east side. The voice in her headset cracked with urgency. She angled down, eyes narrowing. The smoke markers were faint now, nearly swallowed by chaos. Enemy fire flashed across the ridges, relentless, merciless. The pinned soldiers were shrinking against the rocks, running out of cover, running out of time. Her hands gripped. Her ammo counter glared at her, one more full burst, maybe two short ones. That was all. Her chest tightened. One burst wasn't enough to end this fight, but maybe it was enough to buy them time. She steadied her breath, lining up. Her finger hovered. She thought of the men down there, strangers she would never meet, never know. Men who would never know her story, never know her silence, never know the weight she carried. And still, their lives hung on her decision. She fired. The cannon thundered, stones shredded, the ridge collapsed, shouts on the radio cracked with relief. But as dusk cleared, more fire sparked from another ridge, further east. Like the valley itself was multiplying enemies just to test her. Her ammo counter dropped lower, almost gone. Her fuel gauge dipped again. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had nothing left to give, and yet they were still calling her name. Her mind split for just a moment. One part of her remained in the cockpit, disciplined, trained, executing muscle memory. The other part drifted back to a different silence, years earlier. Her first evaluation flight. She had flown clean, every maneuver crisp, every mark hit. She remembered the sunlight on the canopy, the radio calm, the landing smooth. She had walked into the debrief with hope swelling in her chest. But the instructor never looked at her. His notes had been clinical, precise, flawless execution. And then the pause, the sigh, the dismissal hidden in politeness. She flies fine, but I don't see her in combat, not the right instinct. The words had buried themselves in her skin. She carried them through training, through assignments, through every silent moment at briefing tables. And now here she was. Combat instinct, the valley pressing like a vice. She grit her teeth. The words didn't belong here, not anymore. She banked again, forcing herself into the present. Air support, we can't move, they're pinning us hard, request immediate strike. The call jolted her back. Her eyes swept the valley. The enemy was adapting, shifting fire, pressing harder as though they sensed her weakness. Her ammo counter blinked red, final burst. Her throat tightened. Final burst, one chance. If she missed, if she struck wrong, if she hesitated, the men below would pay. Her chest rose and fell, steady, slow. She lined up. For the first time that day, she spoke into the mic. Her voice was calm, steady, even though her heart thundered. Copy, I'm with you. The words startled her. She had spoken them without thought, Not for herself, for them, for the men whose voices she had only heard as static and strain. She squeezed the trigger. The cannon bellowed. Rounds tore across the ridge, fire and stone and chaos merging in a single sweep. The enemy line shattered, crumbling under the storm. Her ammo counter hit 0. Empty. Silence filled the cockpit again. But this silence was different. Not dismissal, not doubt, it was finality. She had given everything the Warthog carried. Now it was only her. The radio came alive. Shouts, cheers, desperate relief. They're pulling back. East Ridge is breaking. God bless that pilot. You just saved us. Her eyes burned, but she blinked hard, forcing clarity. Because it wasn't over. Her fuel gauge screamed red now. She had to climb out soon or risk never making it back. But the ground still burned with fire. Enemy forces weren't gone, only scattered. She could leave. She could justify it. No one would blame her. But her heart wouldn't let her. She circled low, scanning, searching. If she couldn't fire, she could at least see, at least mark, at least be there. And in that moment, something shifted inside her. For years, she had carried silence like a burden, like something that kept her unseen. But now she understood silence didn't have to mean absence. Silence could mean presence, endurance, strength that didn't scream but simply remained. She was still here. Fuel low, ammo gone, body shaking, but still here. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The valley stretched beneath her. The smoke, the fire, the cries, all of it etched into her eyes, her skin, her breath. She whispered to herself, words no one else would ever hear. I'm not leaving you. And though the jet rattled, though her gauges screamed, though every rational part of her told her to climb out, she held steady. Because sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't beg to be seen. Sometimes it simply stays. And that was what she would do. How much longer could the jet hold? The question gnawed at her with every vibration rattling through the cockpit. Warning lights pulsed across the console like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Fuel critically low. Systems damaged. Ammunition gone. And yet she stayed. The valley below remained alive with fire. Enemy movement scattered like ants disturbed by a stone, regrouping, shifting positions. The soldiers she was covering were no longer pinned flat. They were moving, pushing, seizing the moment her last burst had carved for them. Her presence in the sky mattered, even empty, even fragile. But she knew the cost of presence. The A-10 was built to take punishment, to crawl back to base with holes through its wings, engines smoking, hydraulics bleeding, but nothing was limitless. One more hit, one more well-placed round, that was all it would take. Her hand brushed the console, almost like a reassurance. The metal was warm beneath her glove. Stay with me, she thought. The jet groaned in reply. Air support, they're moving east. Cover the advance. The voice in her headset was ragged, breathless, fighting through chaos. She pictured the soldier speaking, dirt in his teeth, fear tight in his throat, hope fragile as glass. Her hand gripped the stick. Her eyes swept the valley. But she had no rounds left to give. Her mouth opened, then closed again. How could she tell them? How could she speak into the headset and admit the silence she carried wasn't just personal now, it was tactical? For years, silence had been forced on her. Now, silence was all she had to offer. But she could still see. She could still fly. She pushed the throttle, banking low, the A-10 groaning as it descended. She skimmed the ridges, her eyes scanning for movement. She found it, enemy fighters shifting east, carrying weapons, darting into new cover. Her finger pressed the comms button. Enemy repositioning, East Ridge, 200 meters north of your smoke. The radio crackled, copy that, adjusting. Her voice had been steady, calm, as though she weren't running on fumes, as though her jet weren't bleeding warnings. For the first time all day, someone listened when she spoke. She circled again, each loop heavier than the last. Fuel dipped lower, a needle scraping bottom. Her mind whispered options: pull out, climb high, return to base. Save yourself while you can. But another voice, quieter, older, rose beneath it. Her father's voice. He had been a mechanic. Long nights in a dim garage, grease on his hands, the radio humming in the background. She remembered being a child, watching him work, the way he'd stay long after he was tired. "Why don't you stop?" she had asked once. He'd smiled, tired but soft. "Because quitting before you're finished means someone else pays the price." She carried that line like a scar. And now, in the cockpit with the valley burning beneath her, the words returned. "If I leave too soon, someone else pays the price." Her jaw tightened, she stayed. The battle below surged. Friendly forces pressed east, their movement cautious but relentless. Every meter they gained she traced from above, her eyes scanning ridges, her voice cutting into comms when she saw threats. She became their shadow, their shield in the sky even without firepower. The radio voices shifted, less panic, more coordination, a rhythm forming where there had only been chaos. One soldier's voice, young and unsteady, broke through. "Pilot, you're still with us, right?" The question pierced her. She wanted to answer, to tell him yes, she was still there, to tell him she wasn't leaving. But her throat closed. Instead, she banked the jet low over their position, engines roaring. Dust kicked up from the blast of her pass, a shadow swallowing their line for an instant. She didn't need words. The sound of her presence was enough. Still, the jet was failing. A warning klaxon blared, sharp and insistent. One of the engines coughed, stuttered, regained rhythm. The frame shook like an exhausted body. She knew she had minutes, maybe less. Her mind raced, not just with tactics but with memory, with faces, with years of being unseen. She thought of the briefing table where her voice had vanished. She thought of the instructors who doubted her. She thought of the silence she had lived in, the silence that had become part of her skin. And for the first time, she didn't hate it. Because silence had brought her here. Silence had taught her to see, to endure, to wait until the moment mattered. And this moment mattered. Even if no one ever remembered her name. Even if the mission report buried her in the margins. Even if her silence continued long after today. The valley would remember. The soldiers on the ground would remember. That was enough. Her fuel gauge hit its last line. Her hand hovered over the comms button. She could call out, admit it, tell them she was leaving. But she hesitated. Not out of pride, not out of stubbornness, out of something softer. Because she didn't want the last thing they heard from her to be, "I'm leaving you." Instead, she whispered into the cockpit, words no one else would hear. "You're not alone." Then she banked again, tracing their advance one more time, her eyes burning every ridge into memory. Her jet coughed again, engines sputtering. She pulled, coaxing, pleading with the machine, just a little longer, just one more circle. And somehow the Warthog obeyed. The radio crackled with new energy. "We're breaking through." They're pulling back, they're retreating east. "Push, push." Exhaled long and slow. Her vision blurred with tears she hadn't expected, not relief for herself, relief for them. The ground was moving, the valley was shifting, lives were saved. And maybe, in some small corner of the story, so was she. But the sky doesn't forgive forever. Her right engine coughed again, this time longer, rougher. The jet tilted, shuddered. She fought the stick, muscles burning, dragging the machine level. Her body trembled with exhaustion. Her head ached from strain. She knew what was coming. The question wasn't if, it was where. And in that fragile space between fear and acceptance, she thought again of silence. Silence had followed her like a shadow. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't her enemy. Maybe silence was her companion, her teacher, her truth. Because silence didn't need to be filled. It didn't need to be explained. It only needed to be endured. And so she endured, even as the jet bled its last, even as the valley stretched below, half smoke, half salvation. She endured. Could she make it back? The question burned hotter than the engine struggling behind her. The right side shuddered, coughing like a wounded animal. Gauges dipped, needles trembling on their last lines. She fought the stick, muscles taut, pulling the Warthog level when it wanted to sag and tumble. Her fuel count was critical now, a number so low it was almost a joke, a cruel one. The valley was fading behind her, but not far enough. She scanned the horizon, her eyes sharp despite the blur of exhaustion. Base was too distant, she knew it. The machine knew it. Even gravity knew it. But part of her still whispered the lie, maybe. Maybe the fuel would stretch. Maybe the engine would hold. Maybe the battered beast could crawl home on stubbornness alone. The A-10 had done it before. Stories told in hangars, half-legend, half-truth, warthogs limping back with wings torn, engines shot, half their skin ripped away. But this wasn't legend, this was her, alone. She pulled the stick again, the cockpit rattling. Sweat stung her eyes. And beneath the roar, beneath the alarms, she heard the quieter voice. You can't leave them like this. Not if you go down here, not if you fall where they can see. She thought of the soldiers on the ground. She had circled them, shadowed them, given them the illusion of safety even after her guns ran dry. They believed in her presence, believed in her endurance. If she went down too close, what would it mean? Would it give them one more wound to carry, one more symbol of fragility in a war already heavy with ghosts? Or would it tell them something else? That she stayed until her body and machine could give no more. Her jaw tightened. She didn't want to be a symbol, she only wanted to be enough. The radio crackled. Air support, we're pushing east, you with us? She swallowed hard, her throat dry. She pressed the comms button, copy still overhead. The lie slid out smooth, steady. The voice of a pilot who had control, not the truth of a woman holding on by threads. She couldn't tell them she was empty, couldn't tell them the fuel was seconds from nothing, couldn't tell them her jet was bleeding out beneath her. Not yet, because they still needed to believe. The horizon stretched ahead, mountains rising like teeth, beyond them base too far, too impossible. Her hand hovered over the emergency checklist, laminated and worn. Words she knew by heart, procedures she could recite in her sleep. But checklists didn't carry doubt, checklists didn't carry silence. Her mind whispered again, softer, older. Her mother's voice this time. You don't have to prove them wrong, just prove yourself right. She remembered the kitchen table, coffee cooling, her mother's eyes tired but kind. Words spoken years ago when she doubted if flight school was worth it. She had carried them, hidden beneath every doubt, every dismissal. And now in the cockpit, they returned with weight. She wasn't flying to prove the briefing room wrong. She wasn't flying to carve her name into some forgotten report. She was flying because these men on the ground needed her, because silence had never meant absence, because presence, steady, enduring, was enough. Even if it ended here. The engine coughed again, harder this time. A deep shudder ran through the frame. Warning lights screamed red. Her heart leapt, then steadied. This was it. She scanned the terrain. The valley floor stretched rough and jagged, no space for a clean landing. But further east past the ridges, a dry riverbed cut through the land, wide enough, flat enough, maybe. She adjusted course. Her hands gripped, her breath steadied. She spoke into the empty cockpit, voice soft, almost like a prayer. Stay with me, just a little longer. The Warthog groaned, but it obeyed. The radio flared again. Air support, we've secured the ridge. They're falling back, we're clear. Shouts followed, relief spilling into the comms, raw and unfiltered. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat. Relief washed through her too, sharp, almost painful. They had made it. And they would never know how close she hadn't. She pressed the comms button, her voice calm despite everything. "Good work, keep moving east, you're clear." She released the button and let the silence return. The dry riverbed loomed ahead, wide, pale, unforgiving. She dropped altitude, the frame rattling. The jet fought her, sluggish, wounded. Her teeth clenched, her arms burned, she pulled anyway. The earth rose fast, too fast. Her breath locked, time slowed. She remembered every ignored word, every silence, every dismissal. And she remembered this, the valley, the roar, the cannon, the men's voices thanking her. She remembered that she had been here, present, enough. The wheels slammed earth, metal screamed. The jet bucked, skidding, tearing across the dry riverbed. Dust swallowed everything. Her body jolted hard against straps. Pain shot through her ribs. Sparks rained past the canopy. The Warthog fought, clawing the earth, engines choking. And then silence. Not the silence of being ignored, not the silence of absence. The silence of stillness. She sat frozen, hands gripping the stick, chest heaving. The cockpit was dim with dust. The alarms had gone quiet. Her heart thundered in the absence of sound. She was alive. Against every measure, every doubt, every limit, alive. The radio crackled faintly, distant through static. "Air support, do you copy? Are you still with us?" Her hand trembled. She pressed the comms button. Her voice was quiet, raw but steady. "Still with you." And though no one saw her, no one in that moment ignored her. Because silence had finally spoken. How long had it been since the engines died? Time blurred in the dust. Minutes stretched into hours or maybe seconds. She couldn't tell anymore. The cockpit was tilted at an angle, one wing buried deep into the earth, the other jutting broken against the pale sky. Sat still, straps cut into her shoulders, ribs aching with every shallow breath. Her hands wouldn't unclench. The stick was useless now, but her fingers held as if letting go meant she'd vanish. She told herself to breathe, to move, to check. But silence pressed in heavy. The kind of silence she had once hated, the silence of being overlooked, dismissed. But this was different. This was the silence of a world that had almost ended, yet hadn't. She was alive, that was the first truth. Alive but stranded. She forced her fingers open one by one. The canopy above was cracked, dust coating the glass. Sunlight bled through, sharp and unforgiving. Her throat burned when she tried to swallow. She reached for her sidearm first, then the emergency beacon. A flick of the switch, a red light blinked weakly. Signal sent. Somewhere, someone would see it. Maybe. But command would ask questions. Why she'd stayed so long. Why she risked her airframe. Why she hadn't broken off when fuel ran dry. She already knew their words. Reckless, disobedient, a liability. Her jaw clenched. They wouldn't say she was human. They wouldn't say she was necessary. Movement in the distance caught her eye. A thin line of dust, figures cresting the ridge far to the west. She squinted through the cracked canopy. Infantry, the very men she had shadowed. Their shapes grew clearer, scattered but steady, moving east toward safety, toward her. Her chest tightened, not with pain but something harder to name. Relief, fear, pride. Would they see the wreck? Would they see her? Would they see more than just a pilot who had fallen short of the runway? The radio hissed alive again, faint with static. "Support, if you're out there, say something." Her hand trembled as she pressed the button. "Alive," she whispered, her voice cracked, weak from dust and exhaustion. She tried again, louder. "Alive, bird down, riverbed east of ridge." Static, then shouts, scattered voices overlapping. Relief. They had heard her. She closed her eyes, the sound washing over her. Not orders, not doubt, just gratitude that she still existed. For a moment, that was enough. The figures grew closer. The squad she had circled above for hours. Their boots raised dust, rifles slung loose now, not in panic but in the calm of survival. They had lived. Because she had not left. Her ribs ached as she tried to unbuckle. The straps resisted, as if they too wanted her to stay bound in the cockpit. She gritted her teeth, shoved, and the latch snapped free. Pain seared her side as she pulled herself out. She dropped clumsy onto the dry riverbed, knees buckling. Sand scraped her palms. She looked back at the Warthog, broken, battered, silent. For so long it had carried her, protected her, let her protect them. Now it rested, spent, as if it too had given everything. "Thank you," she whispered to the machine. It wasn't madness, it was memory. The squad's voices broke her silence. "There, she's here." Boots pounded closer, shadows fell over her, hands reached out. One of the soldiers crouched, eyes wide, relief raw and unfiltered. "You stayed with us," he said, not a question, a truth. Her throat tightened, she couldn't answer. But in their eyes she saw something she hadn't seen in any briefing room. Not dismissal, not doubt. Respect. Hours later the helicopter came. Dust kicked up in a storm, blades roaring. Medics pulled her inside, strapping oxygen to her face, checking her ribs, her pulse. She lay back, eyes half closed, watching the wreck shrink below. The riverbed swallowed the shape of her jet, a scar on the earth. Command's voices were already waiting in her head. Debriefs, reports, cold words typed into clean files. But another voice cut louder, the infantry squad's laughter, their rough words of thanks as they handed her water, clapped her shoulder, said her name. They hadn't ignored her. Not anymore. At the field hospital, questions came fast. Clipboards, stern faces, pens scratching. Why didn't you break off earlier? Why did you stay past fuel minimums? Were you aware of the risk to yourself and the aircraft? Answered carefully, voice even. I was aware. And you still chose to remain. She met their eyes, calm but unyielding. Yes. The silence that followed was heavy. Judgment lingered unsaid, but so did something else. They couldn't quite condemn her. Not with the reports already filed from the ground. Reports that spoke of survival, of support, of a pilot who refused to vanish when the odds said she should. She could feel the weight of both truths pressing down. To command, she was reckless. To those soldiers, she was something else entirely. Which mattered more? She didn't know yet. That night in the cot of the hospital tent, she lay awake. Bandages tight around her ribs, the smell of dust still clinging to her skin. Sleep wouldn't come. Silence pressed in again, but it wasn't empty. It was crowded with voices of the past, the men on the ground, her mother, her own doubts. She remembered the first time she sat in a cockpit, the sheer disbelief that she belonged there. The voices that told her she didn't, that she wouldn't. Now she had written a truth no voice could erase. She had stayed. Whether command honored it or not didn't matter in that moment. She had given what she could, and in giving she had been seen. Her eyes finally closed, not in surrender but in peace. The battle wasn't over, not out there, not inside. But for tonight, silence was no longer her enemy. It was her proof. Why did the room feel colder than the desert at night? Sat straight-backed, uniform stiff across her shoulders, the taste of antiseptic still sharp from the hospital. A row of officers lined the table. Their eyes were polished glass, unreadable. Not enemies, not allies. Just men and women with pens and papers sharp enough to wound. One cleared his throat. "Pilot, let's discuss your decision-making." Decision-making. They said it like an accusation. She stayed silent. "You exceeded mission parameters," another officer added, words clipped. "You flew beyond minimum fuel safety. You exposed both yourself and the aircraft to unnecessary risk." Her jaw tightened. Words pushed against her teeth, but she swallowed them. Unnecessary. The word echoed. Did survival count as unnecessary? Did lives on the ground weigh less than a fuel gauge? She drew in a breath, calm, careful. I stayed because they were still engaged. If I had broken off, they would not be alive. The room shifted, a ripple of discomfort. The officers exchanged looks, scribbled notes. One leaned forward, voice sharper. "That's not the issue, Lieutenant. You disobeyed parameters. We operate on discipline, not personal judgment." Her chest ached, not from her ribs but from the pressure pressing in. She wanted to stand, to shout, to tell them what it had looked like from the sky, men pinned, minutes from being overrun. But she didn't, she just sat, silent. Because she knew silence, too, was a weapon. Outside the hearing room, the corridor hummed with faint voices. Soldiers walked past, boots heavy, conversations low. Leaned against the wall, shoulders slumped, breathing shallow. The official record would brand her reckless. She could feel it already, a mark that would follow her. Her fingers curled into fists. She thought of her jet broken, abandoned in the sand. She thought of herself about to be written the same way. Discarded. But then she heard it, a voice down the corridor, rough, low, familiar. "Ma'am." She turned. The infantry squad, the very men she had circled above. Dust still stained their boots, bandages wrapped around arms, foreheads. Their eyes were tired but steady. The squad leader stepped forward, his voice carrying a weight that no polished officer's tone could match. "They told us you were under review." Nodded, she didn't trust her voice. The soldier's jaw tightened. "That's wrong." Another spoke, younger, still raw from what they'd lived through. "We wouldn't be here without you. You didn't abandon us. You gave us air when no one else could." Her throat tightened. For a moment the corridor blurred. The squad leader straightened, his words steel. "We're filing our own report, all of us. You saved us. They're not erasing that." She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, she nodded slowly, holding their gaze. And for the first time in days, she felt less alone. Command didn't like it. They had their version typed neatly, framed in discipline and procedure. But now there were witnesses, real voices, first-hand truth that didn't fit cleanly into the boxes on their forms. The review dragged on. Days blurred into long hours of questions, transcripts, contradictions. She answered the same points over and over. Her ribs healed slower than the bruises on her pride. At night she lay awake in the barracks, staring at the ceiling. Doubt clawed at her. What if they grounded her? What if she never flew again? She remembered her mother's voice years ago. "They'll try to make you small. You have to choose if you'll let them." Closed her eyes. The choice wasn't clear yet. Weeks later, the decision came down. She was called back to the same sterile room, the same polished faces. One officer cleared his throat. "Lieutenant, the board recognizes your actions as courageous but outside established parameters." Courageous but... She waited for the weight of the sentence. "Effective immediately. You are suspended from active flight pending further evaluation." Her chest tightened. The words landed heavy, final. "Suspended. Grounded." She forced her voice calm. "Understood, sir." And that was it. Dismissed. Outside, the sun was blinding. She walked across the tarmac, each step slow, her shadow stretching long across the concrete. Jets roared in the distance, engines alive with the sound she loved most. But not for her, not anymore. She stopped at the edge of the runway, closed her eyes, listened. And for a moment, the silence was unbearable. Then came the knock. That night in her quarters, she sat at the small desk, hands still, staring at the paperwork of her suspension. A knock broke the quiet. She opened the door. The squad stood there again. Out of uniform now, just men carrying the weight of survival. The leader held something out, a folded flag, edges worn. "This was ours. We carried it through the ridge. We thought it was gone, but it was. It made it out same as us." Blinked, taking it slowly. The fabric felt heavier than it should. He met her eyes. Command can say what they want, but out there you're the reason we're standing. Don't forget that, we won't. The men nodded, each one silent but certain. Then they left, boots fatting down the hall. Stood in the quiet, flag pressed to her chest. And for the first time, the silence didn't feel like defeat. It felt like a promise. Weeks turned to months, the suspension held. She reported daily, filled forms, kept routine. But the air, the sky, it called to her. Every roar of engines above was a reminder. Every time she passed the hangar, her chest ached. But she carried the flag with her, folded tight in her pack. And when doubt threatened to break her, she held it, felt its weight, remembered the voices that mattered. She wasn't erased, not yet. And maybe, she thought, legends weren't written by approval. Maybe they were written by survival. What makes a legend? It isn't the headlines. Knew that now. It wasn't the speeches, the neat reports typed in sterile rooms. Legends were born elsewhere, in the dust, in the silence, in the spaces where rules didn't matter but lives did. And yet here she was, still grounded, still waiting. She walked the base at dawn, boots scuffing the concrete, air sharp with jet fuel. Pilots prepped their aircraft, crews loaded ordnance, engines screamed into life. She stood just outside it all, unseen, like a shadow that didn't quite belong. But sometimes shadows carried truth. One afternoon, weeks after her suspension had settled like a permanent weight, she passed the mess hall and heard her name. Not from officers, from soldiers. She slowed. Inside, a table of infantry leaned close, their voices low but certain. That was her, the A-10 pilot. She stayed when the sky emptied. She circled until we made it out. Another shook his head, almost smiling. They tried to write her off, but she's the reason any of us are here. She's the reason I get to go home to my kid. The words hit harder than any reprimand. Lingered at the doorway, not stepping in, not revealing herself, just listening. The story had already slipped free of the paper walls. It was alive now. Weeks turned into months. Her case stalled, paperwork lost in the tide of bigger operations. She remained in limbo, not cleared, not condemned. But she noticed something. When she walked past soldiers in the hangar, they nodded, quietly, subtle but real, a recognition. When she sat alone in the mess, sometimes someone would leave a tray on her table. Not a word spoken, just presence. It wasn't pity, it was something else. A silent acknowledgement that stories didn't always need permission. One evening, the squad leader, the one she'd saved, found her sitting near the edge of the runway, watching the sunset bleed across the desert sky. He lowered himself beside her. No uniform this time, just a man still carrying the weight of survival. "They're not going to put it in a citation," he said, voice steady. "Not in any official history." Didn't look at him, she just nodded. "I know." "But they can't stop us," he added. Her brow furrowed. He turned to her, eyes lit by the fatting sun. "Every new unit that cycles in, we tell them. We tell them about the day command forgot us, but one pilot didn't. We tell them about the hog that refused to leave. We tell them about you." Her breath caught. "Stories spread, ma'am," he said. "That's how legends are made, not by medals, by memory." For the first time she let herself smile, small, fragile but real. Later, alone in her quarters, she unfolded the flag the squad had given her. She laid it across the bed, fingers tracing the seams, the worn edges. She thought about her mother's voice again. "They'll try to make you small. You have to choose if you'll let them." Maybe she didn't need the sky to prove she wasn't small. Maybe the sky had already remembered. Months later, her suspension ended quietly. No fanfare, no apology, just a stamped paper, evaluation complete, fit for duty. They expected her to slip back into the roster, as if nothing had happened. But she had changed. She took her place in the cockpit again, yes. She flew again, engines roaring beneath her hands. But now, every time she rolled out over the desert, she carried more than her own weight. She carried the memory of those voices. She carried the story that wasn't supposed to exist, but did. Years later, long after that war had shifted, long after new battles and new names filled the reports, story still lingered. She never sought to correct the record. She never demanded recognition. But soldiers whispered it in mess halls, in training yards, on long transports into hostile ground. She was the pilot they ignored, until her hog turned the battle into a legend. The words lived, passed quietly, because sometimes survival is louder than medals. One night much later, sat alone again, older now, her hair touched with gray, her uniform softened by years of wear. She held the flag across her lap, folded neat, its edges still worn. Outside, the base slept. Engines were quiet. The desert wind carried dust against the windows. She thought of the faces, the squad she had once circled for, the ones who had carried her when command tried to erase her. Most of them had long since gone home, families, children, new lives, but in her heart she still heard their voices. "Don't forget that, we won't." She closed her eyes. Maybe dignity didn't shout. Maybe it didn't even speak. Maybe at its strongest it simply acted, once, in silence, and let the world decide whether to remember. And somehow that was enough.